Okay, hi everybody, back this time. So, welcome back. So, in this video, we'll be talking about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Now, a few notes about this work. Written in the mid-19th century, obviously by John Stuart Mill, this work is one of the true classics of literature. It's a book you should read, right? It's not that long. It's about 110 pages. It's written as an essay. As I mentioned, is generally considered a classic. You can find it online for free. Just Google J.S. Mill on Liberty, free, and the full text will come up in a variety of sources. Or if you want to buy a copy of the book, you can find it all over, for very, very modest amounts of money. I mean, I picked this up at a used bookstore. It's a 1948 printing for, I want to say, $2, a very modest amount. So this is recorded in 2020, just prior to the presidential elections. But it is a book, although it was written 170 years ago now, it is extremely pertinent for our times. Extremely pertinent. The arguments as timely today as they were in 1850s. Okay. So again, it has my highest recommendations. And please know that this video lecture does not do the book credit. This is really meant not as a definitive discussion of the work. It is an introduction to the work. Hopefully it piques your interest a little bit and leads you to go ahead and read it. Can easily be done in a couple afternoons. All right, with that, we'll hop right into it. So this is Mill here, right there, reading this book. And so this video lecture is a little different from a lot of the other ones that I've done, because it's just going to be written sort of as a series of questions like this. Ideally, this sort of thing is done best in a classroom setting, and indeed my class that this is for, we've had multiple discussions on this book. But some are not able to attend during the current situation, so that's why we're making this in video. But please recognize that this is a second best solution at the best. Okay, so what is liberty? What does that mean? That's a word that gets thrown all around a lot, particularly in American society and U.S. politics. But liberty is essentially freedom of action. I have the freedom to do as I would. This is liberty. If I choose to go outside now with no jacket, it's quite cold outside, it's my choice. If I choose to drive, a car to the grocery store, it's my choice. If I choose to, not wear a necktie in this video, it's my choice. Okay. And those ideas, the ideas of individual liberty, are central to what we refer to as a liberal society. And that's another thing you hear a lot of. People will say, we live in a liberal society, or the tenets of a liberal society, and so on and so forth. And that's distinguished from an illiberal society, or a society where individual choice is highly constrained, where policy choices, the direction of society, is limited to a handful of people or even just one person. So, for example, a sort of old school kingdom, right, is not a liberal society. It's an illiberal society. And so although we talk about the merits of a liberal society a lot, and rightly so, one thing that we rarely talk about is really the duties that go along with living in a liberal society. And what are the limits of a liberal society? Implicitly, we talk about these all the time, but we never mention them, or I shouldn't say never, we rarely mention them as correspondent with our individual liberties. So, what are the limits of individual liberty? Does a liberal society imply that people can do whatever they want, whenever they want? If no, what are the limits? So one thing we have going on currently, so if you're watching this off into the future, a hot debate in American society right now, the fall of 2020, is whether we can mandate that people wear face coverings when in public to prevent the spread of the virus that's dislocated so many of our lives this year. Is that a reasonable limitation of individual liberty? So on one side you have people say, what's a choice? I should have a choice whether I wear a mask or not. And others will say, well no, because your choices could harm me. And it's not a legitimate choice. And that's something we talk about a lot. We argue about a lot. Okay. And given the sort of the range of that debate, does the state or any other authority have any role to play in this process? Well, what does Mill say about this? Obviously, Mill has nothing to say about COVID-19 because he's dead. But Mill's principles associated with the limits of liberty are quite clear, and they are the foundations of what we refer to as the harm principle today. That is, the limitations of individual liberty are when I might cause harm to others. My liberty, in particular, must not infringe upon the liberty of others. And of course, their liberty as well must not infringe upon my liberties. Putting this another way in terms of rights and duties, the right of liberty, so the right of existence in a liberal society, implies the duty to maintain the liberty of others. Because of course, if my liberty is unlimited, what's to stop me from choosing to poke my neighbor in the eye, to drive my car over their lawn, to hold a party in their living room while they're trying to sleep? These are certainly infringements upon the liberties and choices of others. And therefore, there needs to be some structure in society to ensure that those things do not happen, or if they do, there is some sanction associated with it. Okay, so having covered the basic principles of what liberty is and what the limitations of liberty are, that is, namely, liberty is freedom of choice and freedom in action, and what the limitations are, the limitations occur where my liberty infringes upon the liberty of others, or their liberties infringe upon mine, works either way. Right? Let's delve into some of the nuance of this, particularly on liberty in thought and discussion, right? So, sometimes people will say things like, well, you can't have the wrong thoughts, or the wrong, certain types of discussions are problematic or difficult or have no place in society. Well, Mill would almost certainly differ from that viewpoint. Mill makes the argument in On Liberty that we should tolerate nearly all thought and discussion. And I'll come back to the nearly in just a moment. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason beyond just it being good. in a generic sense. Mill argues that a diverse set of thoughts and opinions in society gives us both more ideas as well as more potential solutions to the problems that we might face. Furthermore, greater quantity and breadth of discussion brings about more information. So, for example, we may find that through the discussions of others, we learn what we don't want to do, what types of behavior we don't want to emulate, just as much as we might find the solutions to the problems that we face. In either case, the breadth and depth of added discussion brings about improved information. Now, I mentioned in almost all cases. Of course, discussion in the right environment can lead to situations where individuals become harmed. Perhaps a textbook example is a discussion of fire in a crowded theater. If one is in a crowded theater and yells fire, it's highly likely that the ensuing disruption and chaos in that environment is going to cause somebody to be hurt, thus violating our harm principle. In a similar matter, if we're in a particularly volatile political environment and somebody were to yell revolution or some such thing, or, let's go get those people, well, that discussion could very likely lead to harm of other individuals, again, violating our harm principle. So there is a soft edge to this. In most cases, in nearly all cases, discussion with good intent should absolutely be tolerated, even where we might find it undesirable. It is only discussion that will directly and identifiably lead to individual harm that requires some sanction. In sum, the rationale for this approach is not simply an argument for good versus wrong. It is an argument that the liberal society will be more innovative and contain better problem solvers when compared to the illiberal society. Next bit, on liberty in action. So if we proceed from the thinking that diversity in thought and opinion is a strength because it yields a broader set of solutions to problems as well as an improved set of information about choices and outcomes, then what follows is how do we ensure or how do we encourage liberty? How do we encourage that diversity? Mill makes the argument that diversity in action is actually uncommon, that most people will tend to do the tried and true. Most people will take the well-worn path and not the new path or the uncharted path. Yet we can see from the last slide that it is the uncharted path, it is the uncharted courses, it's the uncharted ideas that are most likely to add to our base of information as a society, to improve our problem-solving abilities. Moreover, Mill makes the argument that liberty in action, and particularly the choice to do the irregular, builds both strength and judgment. The person who takes the path known by others, the person who always chooses in areas where results are known, does not add to social problem solving. Moreover, it does not tell the individual much about the strengths and weaknesses of various approaches. The uncharted path, on the other hand, teaches the individual about choice, actions, and outcomes, and also provides additional information to society about those actions, choices, and outcomes. Mill argues that these diversity in actions ought not only to be supported and tolerated, as with the last slide, but indeed these ought to be encouraged. We ought to encourage individuals in our society to make choices that are different, to take actions that are unusual, to think thoughts that might be different from what others might think. On this slide, I have a nice little quote from Bertrand Russell. Of course, Bertrand Russell lived long after Mill, but this quote is certainly consistent with what Mill is saying here, and I thought it was quite fitting. It says, "Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, or for that matter in action." I'm adding, obviously. "For every opinion now accepted was once eccentric, was once considered unusual." So those differences, those individuals who make irregular choices, who take paths that are different from the most, it is those individuals that we ought to cherish, indeed, and protect and recognize. Finally, then, the limits of individual liberty. Does this mean that we should let everybody sort of do as it would, completely? No. Mill acknowledges that as individuals within a society, we do have a responsibility to each other. We do have a responsibility to talk to each other about the choices that we're making, the choices that individuals are making, as well as the actions that they're taking. If we see somebody taking an action that we believe to have a poor course, we have a duty as mutual members of society to inform them of what we know. Indeed, the point of most of this diversity is to build a base of information for society to make good decisions on. So, therefore, it would follow that the existing base of information should be used to guide choices at the margin, or to guide current choices. But this is far different from saying that those individuals should be sanctioned. So we might tell somebody, well, I think that's not a great choice. But that's not the same as taking moral sanction upon them. Here I've got a picture of I feel this picture here with these kids. Poor girl. So she's being socially ostracized here, right? It's moral sanction. Moral sanction. So telling somebody that may take a bad course of action is not even moral sanction. But of course we may choose to take moral sanction in some cases. If somebody is doing something that we feel might be destructive to society, it may make sense for that society to take moral action and to impose moral sanction. So, for example, if somebody was, well, let's leave, you can follow the examples. But moral sanction is also not state sanction. Moral sanction is also not physical sanction. And so here we've got a hangman's noose there in the other unpleasant picture. Moral sanction is a far milder sanction when compared to physical or state sanction. Indeed, it's likely that in a liberal society, eccentric individuals, or some of the individuals that perhaps we ought to prize the most, are likely to be socially ostracized. They are choosing different paths, alternative paths, things that are maybe a little different from what most are doing. And so it's highly likely that human nature will lead to many of those individuals facing moral sanction. But of course, we should understand that the actions of those individuals, the choices of those individuals, is ultimately to our benefit. And we should ensure that although they will face moral sanction as a function of just how people are, that we want to be careful that moral sanction never becomes state sanction, that it never becomes physical sanction, that they're never harmed in the way that we mentioned earlier on. That doesn't mean there's never a place for state sanction. There certainly is, right? The clear violations of the harm principle, example, murder, most obvious one and most evident. Society has to take ends to protect itself from individuals who would wantonly violate the liberty of others. And that is the place of state sanction. The degree of state sanction, of course, has to be reflective of the degree to which society feels that it has to protect itself from the disregard of others' individual liberties by the person engaged in the malicious act. Mildly malicious acts, mild state sanctions. Egregiously malicious acts, significant state sanctions. However, even in this, Mill cautions that we should always take every degree to safeguard against the problem of faulty sanction, whether they be moral or state. Indeed, Mill talks about the likelihood of faultiness in these sanctions because of the relationship of moral sanction and state sanction. Different, of course, right? But one to the other. That is to say, as human beings, we tend to ostracize, discount, and generally make life difficult for people who are different, who choose different paths, who take different courses of actions. And it's likely that nature could bias us in taking state sanctions, in taking physical sanctions. In other words, the mob can quickly become the lynch mob if left unchecked. And so therefore, even though Mill acknowledges the need to occasionally take state sanction, to physically sanction the individual, he also recognizes the slippery slope of moving from human nature and moral sanction into using those differences and the associated moral outrage as justification for harm placed upon other individuals. And so because of that slippery slope, it is imperative that society be designed to ensure every safeguard and ensure that we always err on the side of caution when taking state sanction. That's, I think, the short of this. And so let me conclude by saying a few things. What I've sketched out here is the bare bones of the skeleton of Mill's argument. The remainder of the text, or the details that are filled in, and Mill goes through many, many examples, walking us down this path versus that path, this condition versus that condition. And again, I think you'll be surprised with the timeliness of these examples and these distinctions. Again, although written 170 years ago, nearly all of them are pertinent for our times. And fortunately, unlike many other 19th century writers, John Stuart Mill was well ahead of his time in terms of social organization. He was anti-slavery. Of course, this is prior to the U.S. Civil War. And he was for the equal rights of women. Again, in the mid-19th century. And so many of the sort of limitations that we find in a lot of early work in terms of applying our thoughts and ideas about the good society equally. We don't find that in Mill. Now, I'll grant you, some may say, well, wait a second, there's that one, yeah. There are a few points when Mill makes statements that perhaps we would not make today. But I think you'll find that if you read the work in its entirety, you'll find that the intent is perhaps more sound than one might gauge upon initial reaction. Okay, with that, I'll leave it there. I hope this has been enough to get you to read the book. It's well worth your time. You should read it. Okay, thanks everybody. See you next time. Bye.